Have you ever seen The Last of the Mohicans?
Yeah, of course. Great movie.
Remember all those crazy battles with the flintlock muskets?
Yeah, super intense.
Well, those are antique firearms, and here in Canada, they have a whole set of rules around them.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, so today we're doing a deep dive into antique firearms in Canada.
Cool.
We've got legal documents and RCMP guides right here to help us break down what you need to know.
Sounds like it'll be interesting for sure.
So first off, how does the law actually define an antique firearm?
Okay, so according to the Criminal Code of Canada, an antique firearm is any firearm manufactured before 1898
1898, okay.
that's not designed to fire modern ammunition.
So like the old black powder guns and stuff.
Exactly. Those old-timey guns that use black powder and lead balls.
So basically, if it's from before 1898, it's considered antique.
Well, potentially, but there's a catch. The key is that it can't be designed to fire modern rimfire or centerfire cartridges.
Meaning it can't use the ammo you'd find at a store today.
Exactly.
So let's say, hypothetically, I find my great-great-grandfather's old musket in the attic.
Okay.
Would I need a license for that?
That's a great question, and that's where things get kind of interesting. You see, antique firearms, as defined by the Criminal Code, are actually exempt
Exempt.
from the licensing and registration requirements of the Firearms Act. They're basically treated more like historical artifacts.
That makes sense. So you could have an old musket on your wall and not have to worry about paperwork.
Exactly.
But what about those black powder reproduction guns you see at like historical events and reenactments?
Ah, good point.
Those aren't actually from before 1898, right?
You're right, they're not.
So how do they fit into all this?
Well, this is where those RCMP guides we talked about get really specific. They say that some black powder reproductions can be considered antique firearms.
Really?
But there's a bunch of conditions. They have to use flintlock, wheel lock, or matchlock ignition systems.
Okay.
And importantly, they can't be handguns.
For those of us who aren't, history buffs, can you break down those ignition systems?
Of course. Basically, they're very old ways of igniting the gunpowder in a firearm. So flintlock uses a piece of flint striking steel to create a spark.
Okay.
Wheel lock uses a spring-loaded wheel that spins against a piece of pyrite, and matchlock uses a slow-burning cord, kind of like a fuse.
Wow, that's going way back.
Yeah.
So these black powder reproductions are considered antique because they work like really old guns.
Exactly. Because they're limited to those specific ignition systems, they're seen more as historical pieces rather than modern firearms.
That makes sense. What about the black powder reproductions that use percussion caps?
Ah, those are considered regular firearms in Canada.
Even though they're reproductions?
Even though they might look like older guns, the percussion cap system is considered more modern, so you'd need a license for those.
So it's not just about how old the gun is, but the technology it uses too.
Precisely. And the RCMP guide actually goes even further, listing specific calibers that are excluded from the antique firearm classification.
So even if a gun is from before 1898, if it fires one of these specific types of ammo, it's not antique.
That's right. For instance, rifles and shotguns can't be chambered for common .22 caliber rimfire cartridges. And for handguns, there's a whole bunch of calibers that are excluded, including some popular ones like .32 short Colt and .38 special.
Wow, that's super specific. I had no idea there were so many rules.
It's a lot more complicated than people realize.
This is already more than I knew about antique firearms.
And we're just getting started.
Oh man, there's more.
Oh, yeah.
All right, we'll dive back into it in just a sec. Stick with us. All right, so we're back and we're talking about antique firearms in Canada.
Yep. A really interesting area where history and the law kind of intersect.
Before the break, we were going through all the super specific rules around what actually makes a gun an antique, like those caliber exclusions. It's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah, and all those details are there for a reason, to make sure there's no confusion about what's considered an antique firearm and what's not.
It's all about preventing loopholes.
Right, exactly. And ensuring that the only firearms that are exempt from licensing are the ones that genuinely can't fire modern ammunition.
It's fascinating to think that you could have this really old gun, a real museum piece, but if it happens to be chambered for, say, a .38 special,
yeah,
then boom, it's subject to those modern firearm regulations.
You got it. It really comes down to function, not just age. Can it fire modern ammo? If yes, then it's got to be treated like a modern firearm.
Okay, I get it. So let's say someone inherits a firearm that fits all those criteria we talked about, manufactured before 1898, uses one of those old ignition systems, can't fire modern cartridges.
Okay, I'm following.
They wouldn't need a license for it, right? Because it's exempt.
That's right. They'd be exempt from the licensing and registration requirements under the Firearms Act. Yeah. But There's a nuance here that's really important to understand.
Like,
While you might not need a license to actually own an antique firearm, that exemption only applies to certain parts of firearm ownership.
what do you mean?
Okay, so think about it this way. You don't need a license to own that antique firearm, but you still need to be aware of the other regulations that apply, especially when it comes to things like transportation and storage.
Oh, okay. So I can't just like take my great-grandpa's flintlock pistol and throw it in my backpack and head to a reenactment.
Haha, no, not quite. You still need to make sure it's transported safely and securely, just like any other firearm. And when it comes to storing it, well, there are regulations in place to prevent unauthorized access and, to keep everybody safe.
It's a good reminder that even though these antique firearms have that exemption, they are still legally firearms.
Right, they're still firearms, and that means there are responsibilities that come with owning them.
Responsibilities that everyone should take seriously.
Exactly.
So if someone wanted to, really learn all about antique firearms and these regulations, where would they go? It seems like there's a lot to know.
There is, and for anyone who's looking to, really get into firearms in Canada, both antique and modern, I'd recommend BC Firearms Academy.
I've heard they're really good.
They are. They have tons of courses and resources to help people become safe and responsible firearm owners.
They cover everything.
Pretty much, yeah. Their instructors are super knowledgeable and really passionate about what they do.
That's awesome. All right, well, we've gone through quite a bit today. I bet our listeners are already starting to think about all this stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
For sure. We'll be back in just a bit to wrap up our deep dive into the world of antique firearms in Canada. We're back, and it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of antique firearms in Canada. It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it?
It really has. I think we've both learned a lot about this area of firearms law.
We've gone over the legal definitions, the specific calibers, the ignition systems, all those little details that make an antique firearm unique in the eyes of the law.
It's amazing how much thought goes into crafting these regulations, striking that balance between recognizing the historical value of these firearms and making sure they're not posing any risks in today's world.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. And, one thing that really stood out to me is that even though these antique firearms might be exempt from licensing and registration, they're still firearms.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, responsible ownership is crucial.
Couldn't agree more. It doesn't matter if you're talking about a modern handgun or a flintlock pistol from the 1800s, responsibility has to come first.
And speaking of responsible ownership, we've mentioned BC Firearms Academy a few times throughout this episode. I think it's worth highlighting them again as an incredible resource.
For sure. They're a great place to start for anyone looking to learn more about firearms, both antique and modern.
What really struck you about BC Firearms Academy?
Their commitment to education, I'd say. They offer a wide range of courses and resources, covering everything from safe storage practices to the ins and outs of the law.
Their instructors are top-notch, too, from what I've heard. Really passionate about firearms safety and education.
Yeah, you can tell they really care about what they do, and that makes a difference.
Before we officially wrap up, what's one thing that really stuck with you from this whole deep dive?
Good question. I think it's the fact that these regulations, these rules around antique firearms, they actually touch so many different people. We've got collectors, we've got historians, we've got families with heirlooms passed down through generations. It's a reminder that the law has to take all of that into account, even when dealing with something that seems, on the surface, pretty niche.
Yeah, you're right. It's a whole world that most people probably never even think about. It just goes to show you that there's always something new to learn, even about things we think we understand. And, that curiosity, that willingness to learn, it's really important, especially when it comes to laws and regulations. So to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of antique firearms in Canada. We hope you learned something new and that you'll keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.